Hello, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On today's episode, I'm talking to the design polymath David Reinfurt. David is a designer, a publisher, an artist, a curator, a writer, and you might know him from his work with Dexter Sinister, which he runs with Stuart Bailey, or the Serving Library, which is a sort of publishing archive that he runs with Bailey and Angie Kiefer, or his own studio, ORG, which he's run for nearly 20 years. David is a designer that I've been fascinated by for years. I first came upon his work through an essay that he wrote for the Serving Library, but he's also been involved in the great design magazine ... which has writing that's been very influential to me over the years. His projects are always really interesting and live at sort of this intersection between mediums and disciplines and really push the boundaries of what graphic design can be. I visited David's office, which is a basement studio of Dexter Sinister in New York this past summer, and talked to him about his background and how his career has evolved, the relationship between design and writing, the state of design criticism, and the sort of fluid boundaries of graphic design. David's a really thoughtful and interesting person, and I left this conversation really inspired and thinking about a lot. So if you're not familiar with David's work, which you really should be, I encourage you to look over all the work he's done. I put a bunch of links in the show notes, and I hope you enjoy this interview with David Reinfurt. I'm very excited to talk to you. You're different than some of the other people that I've talked to in that I actually don't know a lot about your background. You're someone who I've your name has come up in my research and just over the years, but I don't actually know how you got started or kind of I first came across you through Dexter Sinister and the Serving Library, but I don't really know anything kind of before that. Okay. So I think a good place to start is just a little bit of your background and how you got started.
Pretty, I suppose, non-traditional way to get into graphic design, but then again, a lot of people do this as well. So I also went to the University of North Carolina. I'm from North Carolina. I did not go to school to study graphic design. I had no idea that's what I wanted to do. Okay. It was the university and a place to study liberal arts most generally, and I spread my classes all over the map, from math to music to studio art to public policy, all sorts of things.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't really know. I was just kind of sampling around. I enjoyed it immensely. And sometime about junior year in college, I found a book on the shelf in the library, which was a book about mechanical artwork, which is how you would make artwork to send to the printer before computers were around. Yeah. I mean, I'm 45 now, so I was kind of right at the tail end, right at the beginning of some of that. I found this book and I thought it looked interesting to me because it meshed some of the technical skills, which were always something I was interested in, and art in some degree. I never kind of made visual art or anything growing up. I made music. I made a lot of music, and that's kind of where I came into. That's what, and I did computer programming and things like this. Okay. And those were my creative outlets, much more so than anything visual. So design seemed like a kind of nice synthesis or useful synthesis for me. It made sense to me, mix of kind of technical and creative aspects. So, but at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, there was no design program. There was a design program in Raleigh at NC State, at the design school at NC State. But if I had known, I would have applied for that previously. So I started, however, at University of North Carolina. There was a professor who was teaching a class called Visual Communication that I took several times and was fantastic. And then I continued to take studio art classes and kind of made up a major that was just appearing, which was called Visual Communication, but it really wasn't this in any substantial form. It was within the School of Journalism. That was kind of curious. The School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And this Professor J. Anthony was very influential and fantastic, encouraged me, and
Yeah.
learned lots of things, stoked my interest. So by senior year, then I decided I needed to learn something about how to do it. So I found a small graphic design studio in Durham, and I'd wake up every morning at 6 in the morning before classes, drive over there, and intern there for a few hours, schedule all my classes in the afternoon, and work in the mornings and go to school in the afternoons. And I did this for my last year of college, and graduated and decided immediately I wanted to move to New York, but with the idea of studying graphic design. I thought, I'll study graphic design properly. I'd applied to Pratt to a master's program at Pratt, arrived in New York, didn't know a thing about New York. I was from North Carolina, I didn't know anybody in New York. I was completely uninformed. And I arrived up here, started at Pratt, and decided after just a few times, I decided it was really it was not what I was expecting, and I was not interested in doing it. And so I actually withdrew, canceled all of my loans, everything else I'd prepared, and decided I'd just live in New York because I was more interested in waiting tables and living in New York than studying. That didn't seem like the way I wanted to approach graphic design. I was kind of horrified. So I dropped out. And
how were you feeling? What was it like? What was that feeling when you dropped out and just kind of like studying graphic design, kind of like proper for the first time, and it wasn't what you wanted it to be?
Well, I suppose I was headstrong. I had an idea about what I wanted it to be.
Okay.
And so I felt quite sure about my decision. It was funny. I hadn't really done anything like that before, but it felt like, I was like, this is right. I don't need to do this now. I could do this in a few years.
Yeah.
Or something, this is not right for me right now. It's not that the program was bad or anything like that. I just, it was not.
Right. Yeah.
Didn't seem like a good use of my money at the time. And so, but instead of waiting tables, I already knew something about graphic design, so I put together a portfolio and started doing the portfolio drop-offs, which is how this would happen in the past. And did that, and miraculously got called in to make some graphics for Polaroid cameras at Henry Dreyfuss Associates, a big industrial design firm. Started working there. That was great. Then got some other invitation to freelance in New York at a more corporate place on Park Avenue. Thought I was doing great. Got fired from there. Couldn't find work for many. Anyway, just a kind of rocky beginning. But eventually landed at 212 Associates, a graphic design firm here. And there I got hired because I knew how to run Photoshop. This is when Photoshop was first kind of appearing, and basically I was the person who knew how to use the computer. So I got hired there mostly to work on a Photoshop job, and then that evolved into a full-time job, and they were that studio is very nurturing to me as well, like pointing me. And they worked on projects that weren't corporate, they were explicitly public, and I also valued that. I thought this was great. This was a kind of graphic design I could get behind. And so I worked there for a couple years, and then after that point I decided, I thought it'd be really great. I started to get interested in things on screen. I mean, I already was, but there's starting more opportunities to do this. So this is a long version of the background.
No, that's fine. No, this is interesting.
So at 212, then I had worked on a very early website before Netscape Navigator
Wow. Okay.
existed. It was a website for Reuters, the news company.
Oh, yeah.
So it was like but this was Netscape Navigator 0.9b, like beta.
Wow.
So I worked on this website. I found it really kind of fun, frustrating in other ways, but great. And I had understood that there's a new kind of approach to design out at IDEO in San Francisco, interaction design.
Yeah.
And so I decided that's really where I wanted to be, and so I kind of mailed them some stuff, and surprisingly they were interested and invited me to come out for an interview, and I did, and they offered me a job, and I moved to San Francisco and worked for 2 years at IDEO there under Gita Solomon, who was ran the interaction design part. Bill Mogridge was the head of the office. It was like 11 people at the time, so it's very tiny.
Wow.
So that was a really amazing job. I got to work on interesting things. You had quite a bit of autonomy. I was like 23, 4, 5, 25 probably.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of autonomy and really interesting work. And I was like, okay, this is fabulous. And then IDEO moved from their small office to a bigger office on the water, and the other designers in the office were fantastic. And this was so I guess this was 95 to 97 in San Francisco. So it was also like the first .com boom. Yeah. So it was interesting, and yet at the same time, even after being there for 2 years, I was like, this is about as good as a job is going to get. I was like, okay, this is. Yeah. It was really a very great job with lots of room to think and practice, but I realized that wasn't still what I wanted to do exactly. Okay. Or I wanted to have time to develop my own ideas, not just as you're describing, let your career get away from you. Right. I could have kept on working that way and be in a different position.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar.
Yeah. The opportunities were there.
Yeah.
But I decided what I really wanted to do was go back to school to have time to think about what I wanted to do. Now the three principals who founded 212 Associates met while they were graduate students at Yale, and so that was the kind of, and I knew people who had gone there, and that was the kind of model that I had seen and appealed to me. And so I decided I would apply to Yale, and if I got in, I would go, and if I didn't, I would just keep on working and whatever, do the next thing. And I did, and so I went back to school for 2 years in New Haven. It felt like a step backwards in a lot of ways. At first, at least. Yeah. Until it just changed. My expectations were just upended pretty quickly. That was also the same year that Paul Elliman came and started teaching in New Haven.
Oh, okay.
And Paul was very influential to my work for those 2 years and for a bunch of years afterwards, even now. So he offered a lot of points of view I wasn't hearing otherwise. And so I did 2 years at Yale, and I knew already when I went back, I don't want to work for anybody else. I want to work for myself. Period. When I'm done, that's it. And so when I left Yale, moved to New York City, and I started working for myself. I set up a design studio called ORG, which was just myself, and I gave it a kind of stupid, big sounding name because and a 3-letter acronym and some other things, because I thought this was a way to kind of, there's some degree of kind of play acting going on in this, and so I thought or theater, a kind of self-conscious staging of the practice. And this didn't matter to anybody else, but it mattered to me. Right. I was so eventually got a studio on 39th Street, Midtown, and started working for small clients, whatever, and doing work I was happy with, and then started expanding a little bit just to invite friends and other people who I wanted to collaborate with into the studio to do stuff. Yeah. And so Mark Owens, who was a friend who was at Yale a year afterwards, inviting friends in to work and to do whatever, and have it be a kind of shifting arrangement of people. Yeah. Just in the studio where there's people write, so when I was working with writers, I just have them sit in the studio and infuse that and work there together. Right. Things like this, just to kind of keep it active and keep an exchange of ideas. And in fact, that's where I met. Well, no, I met Prem at Yale, right? When he was an undergrad, I was a graduate. Oh, okay. And then and Rob, same thing. Okay, yeah. Oh, interesting. And Michael, who was my teacher, Michael Rock, who was my teacher. And anyway,
there's definitely, this was not on purpose, but I definitely accidentally stacked all the Yale people at the beginning of this project. But yeah, it was interesting that the way those all connected.
So anyway, ran ORG with this group, kind of me, but it was always sometimes I had assistants, kind of one steady assistant a couple of different times over a period of years. The second of which was who worked with for I don't know how many years, 3 years or so. Stuart Smith, is a great designer. He's actually at Google now. Oh, okay. So, anyway, but the studio ran doing regular projects, but also kind of doing lots of other stuff on the side. I was always writing and doing things at that same time. And like I said, I would invite people in for short amounts of time. So one person I invited in was Prem, who had just moved from Berlin at that time back to the United States. And so I said, Prem, come like use the studio, do something. That was fun. And like very very nice conversations and whatever.
Yeah.
And so there started to build up a kind of nucleus of people around that space. And it would be just as likely like doing a graphic design project as like organizing an event that night, which might be a slideshow or a laser light show as one night or whatever, things like that. So it didn't run in a particularly conventional manner.
It's interesting that all of that is actually very interesting to me, because one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is I feel like, and I think I've even read interviews with you and heard you speak about kind of approaching quote graphic design in the widest sense possible. And that I actually like hearing you talk about that. I hear that as like a thread back from the very beginning where you had a very kind of unconventional design education in North Carolina. And so I don't even know like kind of what the question is there, but I'm curious kind of how you think about that and your work and especially writing, because I came to you as a writer before I had ever seen any of your kind of quote traditional design work. So I don't know, how do you think about that, or how do those all kind of relate to each other in your practice?
Well, I think that's correct. I tend to think about like I'm ambitious for graphic design to be as kind of expansive as possible, and that's not meaning that it should be an umbrella under which lots of different activities happen, but I think you can practice it ambitiously. And by ambitiously, I mean like where it has some consequence other than what the kind of short-term immediate needs are for the project that you're working on. Sometimes it can have an extra gestural resonance, and this is the way that design criticism can work this way. You can write about a project, say write about a piece of architecture, but write about it in such a way that that it's worthwhile reading 20 years later for other reasons. Or a typical book review, right? I love to read book reviews.
Yeah.
And so you read a book review and it's interesting enough to know about that book, but I'm not reading it for that, right?
Yeah.
I'm reading it for the rest of it. And I think graphic design can work in a similar way. Like both kind of fulfill what it needs to fulfill and also have some extra resonance, some extra like dividend, like cultural dividend or whatever. And so I think that's the ambition I have for it. And that is about being expansive, but it's not about a colonizing move of bringing lots, saying, oh, this is graphic design, this is graphic design, this is graphic design. It's not that. It's often what I think people kind of sometimes assume or suggest. And I don't think that's very useful. I like a lot an essay that Hal Foster wrote in Design and Crime. Hal Foster's art critic, art historian, teaches at Princeton. Wrote a small book called Design and Crime, which were short essays around what it sounds like. Yeah. And anyway, in the title essay, Design and Crime, he talks about like disciplinary fluidity, like the way one discipline goes into another, right?
Yeah.
And he actually argues that for design to have some degree of potency, then it's important that it has a shored up boundary, that it's distinct from something else. Like when activities bleed one into the other, then he says that tends to like close down what's possible. I mean, I'm summarizing this badly, but he talks about a little space that's in between disciplines that maybe doesn't quite have a name, as being a site of like play. It's like where design ends and something else starts. In that gray area, there's a lot of movement. And it's not about occupying that gray area. Actually, it's about just being able to have room to push and pull within it. That all sounds overly abstract.
Well, it's interesting though, because I know you've done a lot of writing about like Bruno Munari. Even I'm thinking of like people like the Eames, who I think have seems like they've influenced you, and I feel like they kind of follow that kind of
definitely
thinking in their practice also. I'm curious about kind of how you connected with Stuart Bailey and then Dexter Sinister and ... specifically. ... is something that's been I did not read it as it was coming out. I came to it later, but it's been very influential to me and kind of how I think about a lot of things, not even just design, but even just like distribution and writing and criticism, and kind of how that relationship started and kind of.
I'll describe.
Yeah.
So Stuart was at the Workplatz typography the same year as I was at Yale. That was the first 2 years of Workplatz.
Oh, okay.
And Carl Martins had just started coming to Yale that year. Carl was setting up the Workplatz. Stuart was like his first student. He'd kind of written to Carl and said, or I don't know if he's his first student, but he's in the first class. And anyway, Stuart had found his way there after studying graphic design at Reading, typography at Reading in UK. And Carl started coming to Yale. Paul was also at the Workplatz through Carl, I think not teaching, but maybe visiting. So anyway, through Paul and Carl, then Stuart and I were introduced. And I think Stuart came to New Haven one time to visit Paul. I was still there, and we just hit it off immediately. And we're like, okay, this is good. Yeah. And then it's working together like slowly evolved. I didn't think I wanted to work with anybody, but when he started ... the same year I started ORG, and we were kind of very much in conversation right.
Okay.
From then, and then I started writing in ... early on and was following it and doing all that. And then at some point, I described with ORG, I was opening up studio to other people. I was like, Stuart, you should come and I had this program I called the Org Resident Guest, which was you just come sit in the studio. And I was like, Stuart, come to New York and come do this for 6 months or something, or for 3 months. I don't remember how long it was supposed to be. And he was like, great, I'll do that. He was living in Amsterdam at the time.
Okay.
And he's like, great, that would be really fun. And I was like, if we find something to work on together, then let's work on something together. This would be great. And at the time, we got invited to do a project, a kind of big project, which we decided we'd really take the time and do our proposal right and just make a piece of work as the proposal. That was for graphics for a biennial, Manifesta 6 biennial. So anyway, Stuart was in New York in the studio. We worked on this thing together. We proposed quite a radical idea to them. They accepted it. And so out of that, then part of that idea was to set up a printing and publishing workshop in the context of the biennial, which was to be in Cyprus, on the island of Cyprus.
Okay.
Nicosia, Cyprus. And the name of that workshop was going to be Dexter Sinister.
Okay.
And so so we worked on this project a year and a half, and went to Nicosia a couple times and we're getting everything set up. And then the entire biennial project collapsed for a bunch of reasons, which are not so useful to get into right now. But anyway, so we decided it was just about that time, and I'd been running ORG then for 6 years. And I was kind of getting tired of the kind of overhead of doing that, and I found working with Stuart invigorating, and I'd been thinking a lot, running a small studio, no matter what, like the financial pressure was just constant, absolutely constant. I lived very cheaply in Queens at the time, and I did a lot of other things to keep it not so bad, but I was not interested in like taking work just to pay bills, because I know doesn't add up to me. And so anyway, and I kind of just gotten frustrated by the scale and expansion of, and like assumption that you're just growing and whatever. And so Stuart and I decided, once the biennial was canceled, to situate Dexter, just to take the idea, the name and everything like that, and transplant it to New York. Now, it's also at the same time I decided I would leave that old studio. So I had a party at ORG, demise party I called it, and I gave away everything in the studio. So there are a bunch of people who really actively participate in this, like who participate in ORG, like Stuart Smith and Mark Owens, and lots of Prem, Adam Michaels, lots of people who kind of were very much around, and they brought a lot of energy there, and so. I decided to have a party and just give away everything, all the tables, computers, like everything. Yeah. Just clear it out. Also, at the same time, I was having a child, and I was moving down to this neighborhood, and I decided I want a studio close to home. And so all of that added up to just like giving it away and starting over from scratch. It's like all I need is a laptop, no assistant, no nothing, just like just work.
Interesting.
And this was 2006. And so at the same time, Stuart and I found this basement space. That was actually before the biennial was canceled or anything. I just was like, we're gonna move down here, share a studio, and found this space. It looked very, very crappy at the time. It's only marginally better now.
I mean, for a basement, it's pretty good.
So then, so we took this space, and then the biennial was canceled, and we decided to take Dexter Sinister the name and like transpose those ideas here. We had no idea what that meant. Yeah. But we just thought the idea of kind of working small and keeping it lean as possible, and there in Nicosia, we were going to run a book, like a printing workshop, and we realized pretty quickly that wouldn't work here at all. But what we could do is sell books. And so we had Dots, which had a hard time getting distributed in the United States, and so we thought we would just open up as a bookstore. Like Dexter Sinister would be a bookstore. We'd open up one day a week on Saturdays, and it would sell books. And mostly Dots and some other things we liked, and design things that we liked, or art things. And we ran that as a bookstore for 5 years, and we had very regular events here every 3 months at night. And that was from 2006 to 2011. The strange thing was like the bookstore started really working and paying our rent completely, which just all these things are
for one day, open 1 day a week. Wow.
And online. Also, but in the beginning, just like being here because we weren't paying anything for the dots because we'd already published them. We had them.
Right. Interesting.
So it was crazy. It was very surprising that worked as well as it did, and then like takes the studio rent out of the equation, which then allows you to do different kind of work. It's all, and I think no matter what, with ORG, with Dexter Sinister, even with the serving library, like getting the financial equation working has always been very important to me, because it gives you a lot of room to negotiate or to navigate what you do and how you do it.
Yeah, I mean it's. I want to talk about the serving library in a bit, but that's something interesting that I've been thinking a lot about with this project is kind of, this is actually a much bigger question than I originally intended, but the economics of design criticism or design writing and the value that it brings to the profession, and the economics don't always seem to equal each other.
Right.
And so I guess that's one of the things that makes you an interesting person is because you have your entire career been operating on kind of both of those things. And so I'm again, I don't really know exactly how to phrase this, but like how do you, I like that idea of kind of the fluidity between them. How do you kind of reconcile all these kind of like desperate parts while also being like a studio? Right. Do you know? I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, it does. I think I can start to answer that. Well, first of all, it's not really a studio, so that's the first thing. Like, I do a bunch of different projects, whether it's like ORG, which is now does software mostly,
right,
or Dexter Sinister, which these days mostly does art exhibitions and design commissions.
Okay.
And the Serving Library, which mostly does publishing. Okay. And each of those I work with different people to kind of pull off. And so there's no real, and it probably if it was all under one umbrella, it would be more legible, and there are other advantages to it. But I guess I just prefer the idea of kind of having different kind of bands to play in, essentially. So there's no real studio to reconcile. There's no real.
Okay.
So then, I can answer how writing mixes in with the kind of more hands-on design work, or visual work, or whatever. And so, writing for me from the beginning, like I'm not a natural writer by any stretch. It's not my native territory. What I found really useful in it, which I'm sure started with writing a ... really, or thinking about writing that way, is it's just another way to explore similar ideas that I'm exploring and doing design projects through another way. So I don't think it's not criticism in any useful way. You know, I think Michael Rock is a design critic. You know, I would say what I'm writing is not criticism; it's more like exploration or I mean, they're closer to essays, and they're as much about uncovering and expanding or something. You know, like thinking through a problem. I mean, they're what do they operate more like? They're more propositional, I guess.
Yeah, that was, you know, I'm actually glad that you kind of brought up that distinction, because that was something that I wanted to ask you about. Whether I remember I read an interview with you and Stuart a while ago about ... and this idea of this kind of like crisis almost that you had, where it was like, if we put this in a quote design magazine, this essay that doesn't seem like it's about design, is it still a design magazine? And this kind of like, well, if we just put the stuff in it that we want, it's the magazine that we want. And I feel like that's what I like about the serving library so much, is that it is kind of this wide, expansive, the topics of it kind of are very expansive. And so how would you describe the writing on, well, let's just talk about the serving library, since that's kind of the current thing. Because you're right, I don't see it as like kind of strict design criticism. There's definitely I think a critical component to it. But how do you think about that? And also, what's your kind of involvement in the serving library? Are you kind of editing pieces? And things like
let me describe that
was
first.
Like 3 questions, but
okay, let me describe that part first.
Okay.
At the time. So the serving library is Stuart, myself, and Angie Kiefer. Angie is a writer and an artist. She's based in upstate New York. She also, coincidentally, was at Yale undergraduate at the same time as Rob and Prem.
Okay.
And I was there as a graduate student, so this is just And Angie wrote in ... number 18 first time, and then we started working with her very regularly to write on a number of projects, and just found her amazing, invigorating. And when we started the serving library, we were also interested in just kind of, we ended ... kind of for the same reasons I ended ORG. It was getting too easy to do that same kind of thing, and we wanted to interrupt ourselves. Good idea or bad idea, unclear, but it's like important to kind of like abate, like interrupt lazy thinking. And so when we started the serving library, we thought one thing to shake it up would be like invite somebody else to like make sure it's not just what we were in conversation about. So we invited Angie in, which is not an easy situation because Stuart and I already had a very long track record of talking and developing ideas, and we were continuing to do that as Dexter Sinister, and that was not Angie. And so it was, so that's a little bit, it's a difficult situation to come into. But she also comes from a different point of view, being centrally a kind of a writer as well as a visual art maker, and not slotting easily into any of those categories herself either.
Right.
So it's been so that's how the serving library works. So right now, the 3 of us commission articles, the 3 of us edit articles, the 3 of us write on occasion or regularly in the serving library, in the bulletins of the serving library, and that's how it runs. And we have different like breakdowns of kind of what we're better at. So like I run the website, and Andy deals with subscriptions, and Stuart does. I don't know what Stuart does. I'll do a bunch of other things. But for editorial, we split it. Okay. That way.
And how do you, like for commissioning, how do you kind of decide those decisions?
These come about just organically through people that we're in conversation with anyway. So we'd never like take submissions, as it were, because it doesn't ever make sense for us. There are enough people that we're in conversation with that you also sometimes like push them to write something, like Rob or whatever. And so we're always trying to expand our writers, but we don't want to kind of force it. And so we typically just keep our eyes and ears open, and between the 3 of us in our different circles, like we find a lot of people. and sometimes it works better than others, but we really like it when they're from quite different disciplines. So a writer who has written a number of times recently, Philip Ording is a mathematician who I met through a conference, kind of totally different thing, and like his voice is quite different than other pieces that have been in there, and that's a welcome addition, for example. And we also, as you know, republish things that are in the public domain or whatever.
Yeah.
Just to kind of...
and it's interesting too, and I hadn't thought about this until as you were kind of talking about this, is that what makes the serving library so interesting to me as a reader who really didn't know anything about kind of the workings of it before until you just talking about it, is there is this range of voices that are all kind of very different. There is this range of topics, but there is some sort of, I don't even know if I can articulate, but a tone that connects them all, that when I read it, and maybe it's even in just the distribution and the way that they're all typeset the same way, that it's like, this is a serving library piece.
I mean, that's the goal for sure.
Yeah.
Is that, and you know, through us all working on the editorial, I think it happens that way. I think for sure the kind of form does a lot to cement that. Yeah. And I think there's an approach to it that definitely comes from design, like as much from Stuart and I as Angie as well. There's a way of thinking through some of these things that's as much to do with like the how something is done as like what is done. Yeah. And so I feel like it's most successful when they stay as close to that as possible, even if they're addressing very wide different subjects. I think ... was maybe because the visual vocabulary of it was so kind of relatively loose, but also of a certain recognizably design-centered approach, that then it could corral lots of very different things into it. I don't think it's that different. I just think the approach of now like being templated, which we again just did to upset our expectations from what we'd done before.
Yeah, that's interesting. That actually, it's a great way to kind of lead into some of my final questions, just to kind of start to wrap it up. What do you, as somebody who kind of operates across all of these things, and I'm very interested in the kind of discourse around the design profession, I'm curious as someone who is kind of very involved in that, and this is something that's come up in literally every interview that I've done so far, is that there's more people talking about design than probably ever before. What do you think is lacking in the discourse, or what do you think should be talked about more, or even issues that, or values in design that are not being talked about or written about?
Well, I do think that one thing that's missing, although appearing more and more, are kind of centralized vehicles through which this writing appears.
Okay, yeah.
So something like Design Observer, great. It's it addresses itself to that audience, it commissions articles, it distributes them, and it provides a kind of location for a lot of that. I think the easiest way for me to understand it or think about it is like in the parallel practice of architecture, discipline of architecture, where any number of journals have had very long histories and kind of mark out spaces within the discipline that like through lines through how to practice being an architect. Which identify points of view and concerns and ethics and whatever. And these things appear at different times and are in conversation with journals that have existed before. Well, that hasn't really existed in graphic design to the same extent. Many of the publications don't act like journals as much as kind of like chronicles or something of like what's going on right now. And it's not to do with criticism as much as it is to do with a narrow point of view. And I think I would love to see even I think design blogs, like you bring that up, like I think that acts as a chronicle as well. The trick is that a lot of the interest is in what the things look like, of course. But that is only somewhat the case in architecture because the projects are longer and slower. So there's more room to write and talk about what's not visible. But I think graphic design would benefit from the same kind of examination of the parts that aren't visible.
Yeah.
Because that's what keeps you thinking and you don't dismiss it quite
Yeah.
so quickly. So I'd love to see like more vehicles, more journals, websites, whatever.
Yeah, totally.
And which are in opposition to each other, and which articulate points of view.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm kind of like the way I came to ... I came to Immigrate late.
That's a great example.
And I feel like the thing that I love reading them as like documents of the time, but the thing that's great is how they all talk to each other, and there's things that are responses, and there's arguments and things like that. And I feel like I've said this in multiple of these already, but I think it's easier for me to kind of like look at that with like rose tinted glasses and like look how great that was. But I do think there's something to that seems like doesn't happen as much today. And I think that comes back to like the serving library a little bit too, in that those pieces don't comment on always what's happening right now, but they're a little bit slower, a little slower and thoughtful, which I think adds some value to it.
I think there's a real, I'm advocating for a bunch of other vehicles that maybe have alternative points of view, but I think in my own take, like I am drawn to things which are out of sync with the moment, because I think they help you kind of register what's going on now by their difference. And so I think that's I hope it's a different mode than say like social media feed, which looks at what you look at and then gives you more of what you look at, right?
Right. That's interesting.
And so I think there are other ways, if the goal of, say, articles in the serving library is to like, they're not criticism, but they are meant to kind of foster criticality in the person reading it.
Right.
So it might just make you think about, develop some skills or some interest in thinking more critically.
I love the way that you just articulated that. Actually, that's kind of that's what I was trying to get at, but couldn't phrase that. When people, I have two more questions. When you introduce yourself and you say what you are, how do you do that?
Not easily, and I think it's circumstantial.
Yeah.
I would like for it not to be, but sometimes I say, and then it just doesn't make any sense. And so most often I say I'm a graphic designer, because that's already a big enough tent that people may assume you do not what you do, and that can be a little not ideal. That doesn't.
Yeah.
You're not, in some ways, not being generous because you're not actually saying what you do. But in other situations, I'll say I'm an artist. That just depends on if that would make. I think there's some degree of accommodation, not in terms of like, it's not about being opportunistic or anything like that, but just trying to like actually give somebody an idea of what you actually do. So if it's somebody who knows about graphic design, then you can say, I do graphic design, I publish this thing and do whatever. And that gives a better idea.
Right.
But if it's somebody who maybe doesn't know about any of this, maybe it's easier to say I'm an artist and I work with graphic design, I work with this, and work with that.
Interesting.
I don't mind. I don't mind. I wish there's a simpler answer. But I tend to most often and kind of internally identify as a graphic designer.
Okay.
But sometimes that's just misread to such an extent that it's not productive. They're like, oh, do you do like Whole Foods graphics or whatever? It's like, no, not really. But then you try to explain it, and then it's like makes nonsense. Whereas if the things I do fall much more easily under somebody's conception of an artist. So,
that's interesting. I mean, you have your practice is much more. I like to think that I have an expanded practice. Yours is much more than mine is. But I introduced myself to someone just the other day as a graphic designer, and I was wearing a baseball cap that had like a little emblem on it, and they were like, "Oh, did you design that?" And it's just like, no.
Yeah, and that's kind of, at least they knew that much.
Yeah. It was like, you're like part of the way there, but I don't want to get into what I actually do, and so it's interesting.
If somebody asks. Writer could be an answer for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I imagine they must have the same problem, right? somebody who writes technical manuals could say I'm a writer. They might say I'm a technical writer. Somebody who writes novels could say I'm a writer.
Right.
Somebody who writes, online reviews, same thing. So I don't think the problem is isolated to graphic design.
Yeah.
So in that way, I tend to say I'm a graphic designer, and I think that's. And then when they start asking me what they do, then they're like, wow, that's not what I expected.
Right. Yeah. I love that. I just want to kind of wrap it up with a little bit of your writing.
Yes.
Do you write every day? No?
Writing is painful for me. I don't enjoy the process, strangely. I really enjoy the way it makes my mind bend, but I'm completely not a natural writer. Like, it's not something that I enjoy. I don't like writing emails. I like writing code. I like thinking. I mean, I'm much more kind of logical thinker in that way. But in that way, I think like forcing ideas through the kind of sieve of English text does a lot of good things. It helps me organize thoughts. Same way that putting together a slideshow, I find that much easier to do and much more productive because it's visual and
right.
spatial and other things. But so I certainly don't write every day. I write when I have to.
Yeah.
I can do it, and I like the end results usually. I don't like it when it gets kind of evened out. So sometimes I get asked to write for other publications, and I very rarely accept because it just doesn't make any sense for me. Because yes, I may have phrased that in an awkward manner, but that's also quite important to me, the way that's phrased. That awkwardness is part of it, and it's part of how I speak, and it's part of it's. I don't really want to communicate a set of ideas as I want to address them.
Oh, interesting. How has that
Just mean, yeah.
has that kind of process and distaste influenced the way you work on all these other things, whether it's like curating or publishing or designing? Does that process of writing and working through that and kind of struggling through that and figuring out a way to articulate your ideas seep into those other practices?
Yes, I think it's just harder in writing. It's not like it's that. I mean, I do it, and I'm just in the middle of writing captions for something right now. I'm not enjoying it, but doing it.
Yeah.
And I think writing is a particular case for me because I feel like the point of it is to communicate and stretch it. Same thing maybe with curating could be, but it seems like there's greater chance of failure in writing, or it's clearer when you haven't gotten it right.
Right.
And so that introduces a level of rigor to it that I like. To make sure it actually gets there. And then I also find by writing I get ideas.
Right.
Just by sitting down and doing it, actually sometimes it helps me collect all these strands.
That's interesting. I think that's a good way to end it. Thank you so much for talking with me. This was really interesting.
Good. All right. Excellent.
This episode was recorded on July 22nd, 2016 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.